Welcome back to Bring It Home. I have with me Connor O'Brien, a research and policy analyst at the Economic Innovation Group. Connor, great to have you.
Thanks for having me.
Connor, you've worked a lot on what the high-tech workforce of the past, the present, and the future looks like in the United States. A huge sort of pillar of any kind of like manufacturing renaissance or reindustrialization obviously involves the workers in the factories and the plants, at the suppliers, moving goods and all of that sort of thing. And you've really studied both kind of, at the regional level and also thinking big picture about federal policy, about how to, how the U.S. can sort of best use human capital to achieve its industrial goals. The first white paper I want to talk about, there are two sort of big projects you've published recently, but the first one is called Silicon Heartland, the evolution of Ohio's high-tech workforce. Can you tell us a little bit about the motivation for that project?
Yeah, sure. So, the think tank I work for, the Economic Innovation Group, has done a ton of work on the emerging economic geography of the country, right? The distribution of production, of workers, and critically of opportunity across the U.S., particularly in the aftermath of the Great Recession, but also how it's evolved since then. So we've always had this sort of concern and paid particular attention to what are often called like left behind places or left behind parts of the country, kind of local and regional economies that are not kind of experiencing, the kind of broad economic growth that we'd like to see. And we also have a line of work that is concerned with reindustrialization, manufacturing policy. There's all this energy behind what economists call industrial policy in the United States. And so those two threads, I think, they come together very well in the state of Ohio, right? Ohio is a state that has, a number of large metro areas that used to be very strong in manufacturing and to some extent still are, that have been sort of hollowed out by all the various shocks, trade shocks, the shock of the Great Recession, you name it. So it has sort of this economic geography angle that makes the state a really interesting place to study, but it's also the home of some really high profile industrial policy investments right now, be it the massive Intel plant that's being built outside Columbus. Anduril is building a giant drone factory. I mean, you probably know better than I all the different investments that are happening in Ohio. So these two storylines are coming together in Ohio. And so we wanted to look at, how is the state, how has the history of the state prepared Ohio for this moment? How has the high-tech workforce that is needed to reindustrialize in Ohio, how is that whole process going? What are the policy tools that the state is leveraging? And I think it just all comes together in this sort of very interesting, kind of complicated story here, but one that maybe has some lessons for the rest of the country too, which I'm sure we'll get into.
Yeah, that's interesting. I mean, I think about Ohio. I went to graduate school at University of Michigan and studying the Great Lakes and things like that. My wife was an attorney who worked on the Detroit bankruptcy as well. And so it was interesting, for 18 months, we were totally immersed in this, sort of Great Lakes, like post-industrial municipal finance story that got pretty messy and large, but hopefully the city's back on the right track. And I think about places like Cleveland in Ohio as being or even Toledo as being versions of that. What did you find in thinking about the economic geography of Ohio? Like, what what are the main sources of production, or the most valuable kinds of production happening in the state?
Yeah. So I think first of all, the the kind of stuff you're talking about with Detroit and with like the municipal finance problems that a lot of these areas are running into is like intersects with a lot of this work in some interesting ways, right? Like economists often have often been divided, or for a long time have been divided on place-based policy, meaning like trying to make investments that are tied to particular places rather than particular people, right? And one of the challenges here is that population decline in particular is such a tough problem, in part because it has these self-reinforcing dynamics of like your city loses tax revenue and therefore can't fund the kind of services to make your area competitive. You falling home prices can dampen like construction or outright destroy construction employment. All these different things. So it's a really tough tough problem to kind of fight your way out of.
Right.
And there are a bunch of, Ohio is sort of like, there are a ton of cities right now that, or at least historically have been struggling with this phenomenon. And I would characterize Ohio as like having many of these places, but also in the middle having this dynamic emerging tech hub in its center in Columbus that its success is, it's almost hard to quantify, right? The city has grown so much, and it's become such an attraction for high tech investment that you almost wonder whether it is like actually undermining the revival of other places in the state, right? Because it's such a hub of talent. But I think Columbus has, proven to be very strong in all the different parts of the semiconductor ecosystem. This dates back well before Intel, and it's something I actually learned on my trip there, was just how much of a head start the state kind of had here. And the state also has a long time existing strength in auto manufacturing. I know Honda has a big presence there. They have this Center for Automotive Research that also makes the state not only just a hub of production, but also like a center for innovation in that industry. And that is, a big strength to build on. The state also has some strength in aerospace. I think there's an Air Force presence that's been there for quite a while. That may be why, or at least one reason why.
Home of Neil Armstrong.
Yeah, there you go. And John Glenn, right? Or am I getting that name right? Yeah,
I think so.
Yeah. So that may be a factor for why Anduril chose Ohio as well. So I think it's important to think about, like, when you're at a state or local level, taking stock of like what your existing advantages are, what your existing strengths are, and not trying to be something that is totally like orthogonal to those capabilities, which I think Ohio is doing a relatively good job of so far, right? They're not trying to become like the software hub of the Midwest or something, right?
Right.
Maybe they could do that, but it would be a little bit harder than kind of trying to build around the existing tradition and strength it has in engineering and kind of hard manufacturing.
A few weeks ago, I talked to this not to actually tell another Detroit anecdote, but a few weeks ago, I was talking to this guy, Greg Sharrow, who invented this like new kind of propeller based on this really intricate geometry, and the blades sort of look like these like strange like loops instead of like things that slice through the water. And he was talking about where he decided to locate his company, and he said that he had to reprogram these like machines to cut the steel, and everyone was telling him it's going to take like 4 to 6 weeks to do this, and he found like a fourth generation machinist in Detroit who did it in like 30 minutes.
Amazing.
And so he ended up like moving his company there and hiring all of these people with this sort of this like deep expertise, generational expertise in manufacturing. And I wonder, if you could talk a little bit about the importance of that history and sort of like how those capabilities are sort of cultivated and passed down in a human community.
Yeah, yeah. So I'll start by just saying that the Midwest in general, its history as an engineering powerhouse, as we call it in the report, is just so rich, and the region has been at the forefront of not only just building American, longtime uh, uh, top American manufacturers, but also like pioneering models of training engineers. They've been at the forefront of new models for universities, right? So like the modern co-op program, right, where you're a student at a university, but you sort of get assigned for a term to at work at like a firm, right? That was born in Cincinnati. University of Cincinnati invented the modern co-op program. It's crazy. Now this is at hundreds and hundreds of schools all around the world. Um, you know, the you can also look back at like the history of Ford and General Motors, and they created these institutes that later evolved into universities or programs within the companies that sort of emphasized, on the one hand, like higher level theoretical and conceptual training, but always coming back to being grounded in like, what does this mean on the assembly line? And always like never straying too far from like the details of the manufacturing process, right? And that's important because like ultimately, strength in not just manufacturing, but lots of other industries too, is reliant on what we call tacit knowledge, right? We could not take the world's most cutting edge factory, take those blueprints and plop them somewhere else, right? You could give as detailed plans and blueprints as you want, but ultimately, like the kind of hard to articulate or hard to codify knowledge that is embedded in particular people is what differentiates the highly productive, like world champion kind of manufacturers from those that can't quite cut it, right? And so this is why I highlight kind of the Midwest's strength as an engineering powerhouse, is because while there has been this enormous decline in manufacturing employment in the region, that also presents an opportunity because now we have all of these people like your kind of machinist in Detroit who have just this kind of like deep knowledge that can be tapped and repurposed to the next generation of manufacturing, whatever that may look like. And it's important not to lose sight of the way that knowledge is transferred from person to person and from firm to firm. So often this gets lost by policymakers who sort of view the whole thing as like fantasy football, right? Like we'll sprinkle a little money here, we'll pick the firm that we want to be there, but actually like this is like reindustrializing, rebuilding American manufacturing is a process that requires learning, and it's important not to lose sight of that. Right, it's a muscle that we've maybe not exercised to the same degree as that we used to, and we need to get that strength back. But we need to be thoughtful in how we do that.
Thanks, Connor. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense, and it's an interesting way of thinking about it. If we're trying to get a picture of sort of Ohio's current workforce or current like high tech workforce, and assessing where the strengths and weaknesses are and things like that, I think one place to look is this tool that you used in in Silicon Heartland, the Workforce Competitiveness Index. Can you talk a little bit about that measure and sort of how it's built and what it tells us about Ohio and other Midwestern states?
Yeah, sure. So the Workforce Competitiveness Index is a combination of sort of three different measures. First is the cost of living, right? So this is an obvious kind of input for manufacturers who are thinking about where to site their next plants or their next facility. Is like, what are we going to have to pay to get workers, right? And how attractive is that site for people to live in, right? Like, it's much harder to recruit people to a high cost of living place than a low cost of living place, all else held equal, right? So that is kind of an easier input there. Another input is the production of people with high tech degrees. It sounds a little impersonal to talk producing human beings, but the rate at which we are colleges and universities in the state are graduating people in fields that are in demand by high tech industries. And there's this sort of a wonky way we define that. It's maybe not worth going into here. I'd recommend reading the paper on how we
Sure.
define, although, if you want to ask me, I can elaborate on it a little bit more. But we identify the production of those workers, how aligned is the workforce training pipeline with the demand from high-tech industry employers themselves. And then there's this sort of other trickier input here, which is how well do you retain those graduates, right? So
5 years after graduation, are they still working in the state?
yeah. So we actually think about this in a way that may be counterintuitive, but I think is worth kind of fleshing out a little bit, which is if you're a state that you produce X number of graduates and they are already staying, you are kind of maxed out to some extent, right? The way that you improve your high tech workforce is you have to, or expand your high tech workforce is you have to produce
A
more
surplus.
graduates, a
Right.
surplus, right? You have to produce
Right.
more.
So I see what you're saying. So if say like most engineers from Ohio State were moving to other places for really high paying jobs, that might actually suggest that, hey, Ohio has a lot of a really competitive workforce. They're producing people that lots of people want.
Yes, and it also means that there is a high number of there are a ton of workers who have that engineering training and have ties to the state.
Mhm.
So that if a new employer like an Intel or some high profile tech employer were to plop a bunch of money, plop a bunch of investment in your state,
They might come back.
they might come back or they might stay. So there's this sort of like maybe slack is a good way to think about it, but it's a signal of potential. And I think Ohio doesn't actually do a particularly great job of retaining a lot of its high tech talent. That is in kind of a symptom of what has happened in the state over the last couple decades, but it is also like an enormous opportunity because the region has all of these engineering schools, these really top-notch schools that are producing graduates who, they live in Ohio for a bunch of years. They may want to stay, so there's real opportunity there. So we wrap that up together in the Workforce Competitiveness Index. And we find that Ohio ranks pretty highly. I forget what the number is. I think maybe in the top 20, but the whole upper Midwest in general scores very highly on this index. And I think it's important to highlight that the region scores very well on this index in comparison to the Sun Belt, the Southeast, the kind of places that are directly competing with Midwestern states for these high-profile investments. And I think
Right.
one of
I
the
feel
big,
like in the Southeast imports many more high tech and sort of high tech workers, for lack of a better term.
yeah, exactly. And they may be like kind of lower on cost of living, but they're maxed out to an extent on producing new workers with the credentials and the training that they need, and so they have to um, you know, import those workers from elsewhere. A lot of those come from the Midwest. Um, so so one of the themes that is running throughout the report is basically highlighting that we think the Upper Midwest is still an underrated site um, for this kind of investment, in Ohio in particular.
So does that mean that if the state is, producing a surplus of high tech workers in its universities that are have ties to the state but are nonetheless, seeking employment elsewhere, does that mean that the state sort of just needs like focused like capital in certain sectors to employ those workers and keep them there? What does that mean for growing Ohio's like a high tech economy?
Yeah, I mean, I think from the economic development perspective, it means that policymakers need to uh, align what companies they're chasing, right? What companies they're trying to attract with uh, workforce pipelines, and that's something I think you're starting to see a little bit in the state where uh, the semiconductor presence has really sparked a lot of coordination among different actors here. I talked to folks at Lorain County Community College who are rapidly building out programs for technicians, folks working in the clean rooms and maintaining those rooms, which is actually a lot more complicated than even I had imagined. All the way up through, the Ohio State electrical and computer engineering department, which has doubled in size in just a couple of years and is just rolling out one new credential after the other. It's very, very impressive how they're expanding what they're offering. So I think replicating that across the different sectors that you're targeting is I think the way forward, and keeping focused again on what your strengths are.
Right, that's a good point. That the outflow of high tech workers from Ohio that isn't shouldn't necessarily be 100% attributed to a surplus of workers, but it's also like a fit issue or an alignment issue, as you said earlier.
For sure. And it also speaks to how good the schools are, right? I mean, that
Yeah,
Ohio State's engineering grads are in such high demand that employers all across the country want to hire them. I mean, I think that's great.
yeah, that is great. One of the so you know even though Ohio is producing a surplus of high tech workers, one of the policy recommendations in Silicon Heartland is to think about like high skilled immigration. Can you talk about maybe the role that could or should play in Ohio, and then we can talk about this other project that you worked on, Connor, Exceptional by Design, that goes into much more detail about immigration.
Yeah, yeah. So as it stands, Ohio trains many international students in technical fields, right? Uh, and most of those students eventually leave, and that's a huge missed opportunity. Uh, I've put out estimates showing that more than 60% of all international students who study in the U.S. eventually leave the country because visas are just scarce. Um, and so I think there's as we're thinking about pulling out all the different policy levers to reindustrialize and making these different high-tech manufacturing plans in places like Ohio work, like we have to take seriously, like it can't just be tariffs, right? It can't just be like one batch of subsidies or something. Like we have to take like a wholesale kind of whole of government approach if we truly think that this is an economic or a national security imperative. And I think we're leaving talent on the table if we don't think about immigration policy, high skilled immigration policy, I should say, as a critical piece of this, right? Because I think if you go back throughout history and you look at the different international examples of successful industrial policy stories, again, it goes back to that kind of tacit knowledge point I was making earlier, right? Like engaging with global networks, engaging with, experts from all over the world, using those kind of key staff, key technicians, key scientists, etc. That's always been key to those stories. So that we can't forget that here, even though predominantly this stuff is going to be it's overwhelmingly going to be American workers, right? And our focus should be on improving those pathways as well. But we would be like handicapping ourselves if we took high skilled immigration off the table.
Right. And, the H-1B1 visa controversy has been in the news again recently. They're imposing or trying to impose some kind of much higher fee, maybe 100 times or 10 times what it currently is now. Although it's unclear as to how exactly it'll be applied and when it will be imposed and things like that. But can you talk a little bit about how like H-1B looks now versus what an immigration system focused on the high skilled workers would look like?
Yeah. So right now, the H-1B is meant for workers in so-called specialty occupations. That's pretty broad, right? It includes, programmers, but also, all kinds of other like STEM talent. I think it may even include acupuncturists. It's pretty broad, and among the eligible applicants, the people who actually get the visas are selected at random, which is totally crazy, right? This is the primary way that we recruit high-skilled newcomers to the United States, and we just give them away randomly.
It almost reminds me. It's almost like a consequence of the idea that, like, coming to America is this like blessing and gift, and everyone has an equal right to it. But there's only a certain amount of spots, and we just have to dole them out in quote unquote the fairest way possible, right? Rather than like perhaps a more pragmatic kind of mindset or approach to the whole thing, where it's like, no, we're actually just headhunting the best people, and it has nothing to do with like everyone's sort of inherent right to come here, but it's focused on like the people that we actually want and need.
Yeah. So, I mean, the lottery itself actually emerged somewhat accidentally. Originally, it was supposed to be you accept the petitions in the order in which they arrive to the government. But the rise of the internet and the creation of like electronic applications meant that basically so many of them would come in simultaneously. So USCIS decided that the only fair way to pick among these applicants that are all arriving basically at the same time is to choose randomly. And nobody likes this. Nobody actually defends the lottery on its merits, but people disagree so intensely and so much about what the alternative should be that the status quo has just sort of like persisted as this zombie system for so long. But I think like the clear path to reform here is to do a wage ranking and to say we're going to take the highest paid top applicants for this visa. We're going to put them at the top of the list, and we're just going to take them in descending order of salary, or maybe you apply some multiplier to the salary for younger workers because like they're going to contribute most over the long term. We can get into debates about like how to properly weight age I mean, I think people can disagree in good faith here. But I think, right now the H-1B is unpopular in part because it's overwhelmingly, well, it's not overwhelmingly. About half the program is basically like outsourcing companies, the Tatas and Infosys, those kinds of places. They benefit from the randomness of the lottery. They're playing a numbers game. It doesn't matter whether they get a particular applicant. They just need a certain number of applications. So they know that if they just flood the system with applications, that they're going to get their desired number. Whereas if you're a startup, or if you're a company that has identified a key person, like a chief technical officer or something, or some absolutely awesome engineer that you must have, and you're willing to pay that guy $250,000 or $300,000, if you
There's no way for you to make sure that he can like get ahead in line in front of
it doesn't matter how skilled they are. You have the same chance of getting the visa for that person as the outsourcer does for the analyst making 70K. So I mean, I think like a salary ranking would immediately off the bat destroy the business model of those outsourcing companies, but it would also provide much more certainty for getting that kind of top talent, because that if you pay someone X dollars, right, and that's generally over the threshold, that you're going to get that person. You're going to get a visa for that person, subject to any kind of national security reviews or whatever, right? That if you make an offer to that person, you're going to get the person that you want. I think that would be really good for startups, really all kinds of firms that are chasing that truly exceptional talent that could make a difference for their firm's future.
No, that's actually really interesting, and it seems like it would like adding that sort of like market dynamic, or that pricing dynamic, or the pricing mechanism to the visa program seems like it would solve a lot of different issues that people have kind of simultaneously.
Yeah, for sure.
But that's interesting. You also, I believe you also argue for expanding the number of high skilled immigration, or the number of sort of like worker visas, while focusing on the high skilled immigration. I think the New York Times published in the last year a study of sort of the explosion in net immigration to the United States during the Biden administration, and kind of acknowledged that the proportion of foreign-born people living in the United States is higher than it ever was in the 20th century, even after the immigration waves that we associate with like Ellis Island and things like that. So in that context, how do you make the case for expanding this program to be even larger than it is?
Yeah, I mean, I think the question over overall immigration levels is a real challenge, and it's one that we don't necessarily touch all that much on in the report. But our argument really is that high skilled immigration has such overwhelmingly positive spillover benefits to American workers, American companies, American communities, that are just so hard that are so hard to ignore. It's like the closest thing to a free lunch that we have in our economic policy toolkit. We know that
or you can sort of get all of someone's production without having to give them infant health care and subsidize their daycare and give them a school and et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah, so like high skilled immigrants, I mean, even in our current imperfect system that does not select for the highest paid people, like they're huge net fiscal benefits, right? Like we estimate that the average H-1B contributes about $40,000 more per year in tax revenue than they use in benefits. And that's with, again, all the problems that we've talked about with the H-1B. Like in our ideal world, like our ideal system that we propose, average salaries would be way higher for that program. And, so would the net fiscal benefits here. But we know that high skilled immigration is it makes companies more innovative. These folks are really entrepreneurial. They make their colleagues more productive. They produce a ridiculously high share of patents, particularly in industries that are like of importance and competition with China. And also critically, like they may even reduce inequality by making kind of blue collar work and blue collar services more in demand, right? Because a computer programmer making 200K, they don't contribute to like the supply of blue collar workers, the goods and
Right.
services that they produce, but they add a lot to the demand, right? So
Right.
it could be
Probably not mowing their own yard.
Right. Exactly. Yeah. Or cutting hair. Right. I mean, there's the famous. I use that example because that's one that Enrico Moretti famously uses in his book, The New Geography of Jobs, where he basically shows that like the pay of barbers is actually determined by like the presence of
Rich
high
people.
skilled workers like in your community. Yeah.
That's interesting. One thing I noticed from our conversation, Connor, is that we kind of talk about young workers and foreign workers, and maybe we can lump those together in a category of like new workers to an economy. But we haven't talked very much about like this idea that the unemployed of like Flint, Michigan can be like retrained to, build something entirely different. And I wondered what your thoughts on those sorts of programs and initiatives are, whether they're effective and what their place might be.
Yeah, so I'm a relative newcomer to this kind of policy area, but in our Silicon Heartland report, we highlight and recommend this proposal by American Compass, which is a conservative think tank in DC that is very focused on industrial policy and manufacturing, and they propose basically a $10,000 per worker training grant that workers can carry with them and carry with them wherever they go, and they can redeem that outside maybe the traditional workforce development pipelines, right? Because I think we should be a little bit humble here about what works and what doesn't, and we should take a kind of like demands driven approach here, right? I mean, we have WIOA, we have kind of traditional apprenticeship programs, traditional pipelines. It's clear that at least some of these things aren't really working, and so I think a kind of open-ended grant or an open-ended subsidy goes to workers and goes to firms and says, what do you need, right? Like go find or go create like the kind of program that you need, and we're gonna like go around the traditional gatekeepers here, and I think that's kind of the attitude that we should take towards this policy area.
That makes sense to me. It's like sort of like de-risking job creation, letting the company provide like the training, for the role, let them choose, instead of like spinning up a campus of a community college and like 5 years later you're training them for something that for
Exactly.
jobs
And
that don't necessarily exist.
Yeah, there's a tension here because on one hand, like the government wants to make sure that people are getting a good value from the credentials that they're chasing, right? So that kind of creates some desire for stronger oversight. But on the other hand, like that also creates the risk that policymakers will chase the shiny thing rather than the thing that's actually in demand, right? So we take a more agnostic approach here.
Interesting. No, that's Again, it's sort of a marketplace solution, not necessarily because, or maybe it is, but because of some sort of like dogmatic economic theory, but just because it's like, oh, like that's just like the most efficient way to identify like, value and things like that.
Yeah, and it's something that, I mean, to go back to some of the Silicon Heartland stuff, like the key to the workforce training pipelines, the key to their success throughout the 20th century was that they've remained, attached at the hip to actual production processes. They were laser focused on, what matters for being on the factory floor, what matters for, improving, actually existing processes. What problems do we actually come across in practice? And I think like, that you can quickly lose that when, it's third parties that are more detached from the needs of industry that are designing these things.
Connor, thank you so much for coming on the show. Tune in 2 weeks for the next episode. You can find us, check out our website at bringithome.us. We're on Apple Podcasts, YouTube, and all your favorite places to listen to podcasts. All right, until next time, thank you.